Welcome back to the Evolution of Dental podcast, brought to you by Evolution Dental Science, where we explore the stories of the people and the technology shaping the world of dentistry. I'm your host, Rob Norton. Today we're joined by Dr. Nate Lawson of UAB, who is a fascinating doctor who's done both clinical work as well as material science research. Dr. Lawson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this? Like, did you wake up one day and go, I'm going to research materials or dentistry, or how did that come together?
Yeah, so my story was that I always wanted to go to dental school or become a dentist since I was a kid because I have a lot of aunts and uncles. Like my mom, on her side of the family, everybody's a dentist or married to a dentist. And so I always wanted to go to dental school. I went to college in New Orleans at Tulane, and I did engineering because I was so bad at foreign languages. I thought it'd help my GPA if I did engineering and didn't have to take a foreign language. And I like engineering. And then when I was looking to get into dental school, I went by the LSU dental school to look for a research project to do. And I ran into this guy named John Burgess, who was teaching there. That some people may know him. He was kind of a legend in the field of dental materials testing. So I did research with him. And when I was applying for dental school, it was right around the time of Hurricane Katrina. So that was my senior year of college. And so I had wanted to go up to the Northeast just for fun, to go up to that area to go to dental school. And then Burgess had transferred here to UAB to continue his materials research because LSU was kind of underwater at that period of time. And so he said, Nate, would you want to come up here and go to dental school in Alabama? So we continued to work together for another 6 years when I was in graduate school. I went through a quarter life crisis, worked a couple clinical jobs, and then Burgess at that period of time thought he wanted to retire. And so he called me and said, Nate, would you want to come back to Alabama and teach at the dental school and kind of take over my empire of dental materials teaching? And, the pay is so bad in academics. I was like, well, maybe I'll do this for, a little while I figure my life out. And I came down here and started working with him. And first of all, I just loved it. I mean, I love my job. I love coming in and doing what I do every day. Also within 9 months, I met Rachel, who became my wife, who's from here. So now I'm stuck here. I'm never getting out. So that's also what's kept me in this job. But yeah, I came down to kind of take over this programming which is a 2 years master's program where we teach dentists and people that have a lot of internationally trained dentists and some U.S. dentists how to evaluate dental materials of a 2 years master's program. And along the way, we evaluate tons of new dental materials. And then I love speaking, so I get to go out and speak about it and do CE events, and we do a lot of publishing. And so, but yeah, I love my job. So I like this job.
So Hurricane Katrina, that was what, 2005 or something like that?
2005. Wow, that's great memory.
You said they was literally underwater over there.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of changes in the world of dental materials since 2005 to, I guess, 20 years later now, right?
Yeah.
So one of the big questions is always Zirconia or e.max?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Oh, yeah, it's a great, so yeah, I mean, if you want to just to back up even a step, yeah, you brought up a great point. So I graduated dental school in 2011 here at the UAB School of Dentistry. And I mean, my first crown was a full gold crown. And then I think that was the only one I did. And then after that, everything was PFM. I never got to touch e.max. And then Zirconia, Brooks era was just coming out of Glidewell when I was finishing up school. So none of us did Zirconia crowns. Some people did e.interior e.max veneers or crowns. I didn't. I was a bad dental student, so they never let me touch complicated stuff. And so I then went to go practice in a DSO setting, and we were doing these cheap $40 probably base metal alloy PFM crowns. And it wasn't until I came back and started teaching in 2014 that I came back to the school and realizing they had just that short period of time, they made this transition to being a completely Zirconia school. And I was thinking about how we went to this ceramic revolution. Probably I'm thinking because of Zirconia being this cool material where you could do these minimally invasive preparations of manufacturers to say 0.6 millimeters material thickness. Now we're telling our students closer to 0.8 material thickness. So these really conservative preparations, but have tooth colored rather than gold. Also, with a high strength of Zirconia, you can cement it rather than having to adhesively bond it. And then also just the cost. I mean, when I did a PFM crown, I don't know what the metal cost is going to be on that thing. So my lab bill is kind of at least in the lab that we're using at the dental school here, it's kind of variable cost, whereas the Zirconia is they've gone up a little bit in price, but they're pretty affordable as far as
Yeah, metal fluctuates literally every day. I mean, obviously,
yes,
it depends on whether you're using, like, chrome cobalt, or you need some kinda non-precious or some gold alloy. I mean, Lord have mercy, gold's up past $5,000 an ounce now, which if you told anybody in 2005, they'd certainly buy more gold. But, yeah, that just and gold rising gold costs, at least for the lab side, for sure, is a huge contributing factor to well, maybe we do need to change what we're doing here and look at this scary technology that surrounds zirconia because,
yeah,
the cost of zirconia, even now or then, it's $5, $10 a unit just in base materials versus gold, which could be hundreds of dollars or chrome
yeah.
cobalt, any of those. So, yeah, you witnessed the revolution in the ceramic world.
Yeah, yeah, it happened quickly. It was, like, right at that period in time of, like, that 2000 I think there was a study that was done, I think Christiansen did 2008 versus 2013 of, like, Glidewell's production of all ceramic versus PFM, and it went from, like, 28% to, like, 72% of their crowns were, ceramic, but I ignored your initial question, Rob, which was, like, e.max versus zirconia. I just wanted to talk about the other thing first, but, yeah, as far as zirconia versus e.max, I mean, I think of it from, like, different applications. I mean, like, when I think of Emacs, I'm thinking of, like, anything bonded. I do a lot of, like, partial coverage. I've gotten into this whole world of, like, um, adhesive dentistry and doing these, really, a lot of these partial coverage restorations where I can be more it's tooth saving with my
Mhm.
preparations, and so I could bond zirconia. I mean, we've done a lot of research that you can bond zirconia, but I think it's just more traditional to bond lithium-based silicate. There's just a longer track record of doing it. So with a lot of my partial coverage restorations, when I'm picking lithium-based silicate, anterior restorations, I feel like it's kind of like some considerations. I mean, I guess if there's like you have to block something out. Like if you could use the PFZ or poison fused with zirconia. The lithium silicate would be a great option if you've got a like good color substrate. But then, even though you don't have to bond lithium disilicate, I still like bonding it. So if I got like deep margins and I think it's gonna be hard to bond in the anterior case, that might be a reason to think about using zirconia, maybe using like one of the translucent shades of zirconia. And I would say for posterior crowns, my workhorse is still zirconia. And for bridges, it's the only thing I would ever consider for a bridge would be zirconia. So yeah, I mean, I think that I can't imagine being limited to just one of those. Like if somebody said you had to do dentistry and you had to buy a machine that was going to make all of your restorations for you, and you had to buy a zirconia machine and a lithium silicate machine, I'd be like, that'd be really hard. That'd make me really sad. And if they still you could only use one composite, I'd be like, I could probably do that. Is that you can only use Emax or zirconia. I don't think I could do it.
Yeah, you'd be sidelining yourself into a particular workflow, and I'd say that that's probably a lot to do with the strength, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and bondability. I mean, like I said, I guess you can bond zirconia, but it's just more. Even as someone that bonds zirconia and believes in zirconia bonding and talks about zirconia bonding, if I'm doing a bonded restoration, there's something about the track record with that material's bonding that just makes me feel a little more comfortable. And so, yeah, and then I guess yeah, zirconia having the advantage of strength and not just strength, but also like I know pre-recording, we are having this conversation a little bit about some of these, advanced topics in ceramics, and so it's not just the strength, it's also the toughness of the material, like the ability to heal cracks, and so I was telling you about we were talking about Weibull analysis of, like, ceramic materials, meaning that, like, you might have something that has a really high strength, but it's not as reliable of a material because it's susceptible to crack damage. So you might if you make 10 specimens out, you might have like this specimens that don't have any cracks do really well, but if you have a couple specimens that have these cracks and they cause ultimate failure of the material, then it's not a very reliable material. Whereas if you had a material that was like zirconia is what's so special about it is it's got this ability to heal its own cracks that really makes it kind of a special, especially the high strength. I don't know if we want to talk about different kinds of zirconia, but the high
No,
strength.
I absolutely wanna talk about different types of zirconia. In fact, I think that the healing aspect of it is probably widely unknown. I think more people are familiar with microfractures, then probably the ability for the material to heal itself and the unique nature of the both the grain structure and the chemical nature of zirconia versus, say, lithium disilicate derivatives like e.max or others. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'd love to share more about that, please.
Yeah. No, I mean, so that process of transformation, toughening of zirconia is, I think, I still remember some of the initial commercials of zirconia crowns where they would take them and just hammer them with a hammer and drive them into a piece of wood. And like toughness of zirconia comes from this transformation toughening, which means that, like you were mentioning earlier, like zirconia is just a collection of crystals all packed up one next to each other. And what causes any brittle material, like any ceramic, to fail is a crack propagating through the material, and cracks can propagate through ceramics. And zirconia has this neat thing where the initial formulations of zirconia had all of those crystals that we call grains that are all next to each other. And if a crack starts to form, the the crystalline structure of those crystals or grains will rearrange itself into a different atomic structure to make those crystals slightly bigger. And what that means is that when the crack is trying to go through there, it gets through a patch of crystals. Those crystals rearrange themselves, makes themselves slightly bigger, and it kind of compresses that crack and stops it from growing further into the material. And like that's kind of a unique function of zirconia, like you're saying. It doesn't happen in lithium disilicate. It doesn't happen. There's some materials that are like doped or reinforced with zirconia. If the materials just partially zirconia is not that's not going to be as helpful. But yeah, if a material is like a pure crystalline material like zirconia, and it's the original formulations of zirconia that have all this so-called tetragonal crystals in there, they can heal their own cracks.
Well, that's probably a term that some of us have heard, but many of them are unfamiliar. So everyone's heard of like cubic zirconia. What's the difference between like a cubit versus a tetragonal zirconia grain?
Yeah, so it's great point. So yeah, like when I think of like zirconia, I mean it's a ceramic, and ceramics are composed of metallic and non-metallic elements held together by covalent or ionic bonding in these lattice formations. So the lattice formations are just like the arrangements of that zirconium and oxygen, um, molecules in zirconia. And like it's kind of, I think back to, like, I don't know, when I was in high school chemistry, I remember them doing these experiments with like tennis balls, and they'd take a little like plastic bin, and they'd put tennis balls in where they put one layer of tennis balls, and the next layer they put the tennis balls in the spaces in between each tennis ball, and they show you how you could pack them into that arrangement. And then they say you can also pack them in a way where you put the tennis balls on top of each other, and that's a different type of atomic packing or a type of crystal structure. So there's different kinds of crystalline structures, like arrangements of those atoms. And so cubic is a more symmetrical arrangement. And the advantage of the cubic arrangement is that since it's more symmetrical, like the spaces between atoms are more like there's more directions that light can pass through the spacing between atoms, which allows cubic to be a more translucent crystal, because again, it's more symmetrical. There's more directions from which light can pass through atoms to get through to make it more translucent. That's the advantage of cubic. Tetragonal, on the other hand, is more, doesn't have as many directions that light can pass through, but the advantage is that the tetragonal crystal, when it feels a stress next to it, like the crack, those atoms can rearrange into a third arrangement, which is called monoclinic. And monoclinic, the atoms are just spaced 3 to 4% further apart. So the volume of a tetragonal crystal is 3 to 4% smaller than monoclinic, or better way to say it is monoclinic is 3 to 4% bigger than a tetragonal. And so again, what happens is when you have a crack pass through a bunch of tetragonal crystals, the atoms rearrange themselves to become the monoclinic crystal. The crystal grows, and as the crystal grows, it compresses that crack and stops it from driving its way through that zirconia crown or bridge or whatever, hybrid or whatever you just made out of zirconia. So that's like the magic beauty of like the zirconias that have a lot of tetragonal in them.
That's a beautiful explanation. And, so the chemical differences between, say, more high strength zirconia versus higher translucency,
Yeah.
what variation is there? Is there a different chemistry that goes in with that? And
Yeah.
how does that influence how a doctor should choose which material to use, or lab for that matter?
Well, yeah, that's such a great question, Rob. Yeah, and I know that you know the answer, and you're setting me up for these fun answers. But
Like
yeah,
I said, this is something I
yeah,
find fascinating, and I've done a
yeah,
lot of research on over the years. I had my own Zirconia lab for, 10 years, so this is something I
yeah,
poured myself deep into,
yeah. No,
and, it's just fascinating to have a conversation with somebody who's been more deeply involved in the research aspect of it, so,
I know. Yeah, I love
whereas I
talking.
know enough to ask the question, you know more about the answer than I
Uh,
do, and I think
no,
it'd be
no, I could
very
tell by the
helpful
way you asked
for
the
a lot of
question.
us.
You know
Sure.
plenty. But yeah, so the answer. So I mean, so yeah, so explain to our audience, like, the chemical difference between, like, let's say zirconia that's got a lot of cubic in it versus one that doesn't have any cubic in it is this dopant to that, and they're called yttria. So like yttria is added at a very small percent, so, with the zirconium and oxygen that at a 3%, 3 mole percent of yttria, you will stabilize about, I would say predominantly tetragonal crystals. I mean, there are some papers that have looked at it and they said, oh, it's actually only 95% or 92% tetragonal. But I just, in my mind, I think of it, if you've got 3 mole% yttria, then you've stabilized all tetragonal crystals. And as you increase the amount of yttria, you go up to like 4 mole%, then you get about 25% cubic, 75% tetragonal. And when you get it to 5Y, it's like, I think of it as like 50-50, 50 tetragonal, 50% cubic. And so that means that when you've got more yttria in there, you're going to make a more translucent zirconia because it will have more of the cubic. But, the disadvantage, of course, is that now you're not going to be able to do as much of that transformation toughening. You won't be able to heal cracks as well. So that's why when you get up to zirconias that have 5 mole% yttria, they're prettier and they're more translucent, but you're losing a lot of the strength and toughness, like ability to heal cracks. And then and again, as I know, Rob, we'll talk about this yttria percentage, this 3 mole% yttria. The way they abbreviate this is 3Y is 3 mole% yttria, 4Y is 4 mole% yttria, and then 5Y is 5 mole% yttria. And so 3Y, 3 mole% yttria is strong but opaque, 5Y, 5 mole% yttria, translucent but weaker. And so, of course, yeah, that would get to like how you would use these materials clinically. And yeah, the clinical use for them, everybody's got their own opinions on. I mean, I have my own opinions on. I like using 3Y as much as possible. 4Y I might use in like a case of an anterior bridge, and then maybe 5Y I would use. I use those if like I'm doing like an anterior restoration where I don't put porcelain on it, like a monolithic, and maybe I would normally use lithium disilicate, but maybe if I don't want to bond it and I just want to use conventional cement, I could use a 5Y zirconia and cement it like my margins were deep or something like that. So that's kind of my I guess take on the different generations of. I mean, there's so much more things we could go into, like multi-layer zirconias and
That was actually my next question was
yeah.
actually how you feel that influences multi-layer. Do you like multi-layer or appreciated materials? And, what are some of the advantages of using appreciated or multi-layer versus, say, traditional staining? Because I'm not sure every doctor knows that. I know a lot of labs are probably familiar with that, especially if they've seen it growing over the years, but, there's more than just efficiency trade-offs, I feel, with, the pre-stained versus the custom hand-dipped stains. Or sometimes painted, like, cases of, like, the Zirconzon stains. Like,
Yeah.
what's your experience been with that? From a material research perspective as well as a practicing doctor?
Yeah. That's a good point. So, yeah, when you talk about like multi-layered zirconias, I think it initially used to be like, like I think of like the katanas, like the katana HTMLs and STMLs and that kind of thing. The multi-layer was just a very gradation in colors. Like, you could have a yellower cervical area and a less yellow incisal area of your zirconia disc. And so the multi-layer only implied chroma or color differences. And then now there's more recently there's been those multi-layer discs where the powders at the bottom of the disc are like a 3Y zirconia, and then they might have a gradation of powders of, some 3Y, 4Y mixed, and then the top layer being a 4Y. And you've got some that, you could vary the powders in any kind of way, and manufacturers will tell us to an extent how the powders are varied in these multi-layered blocks. But the first thing you were talking about was the multi-layered as far as color. The alternative to multi-layering the color would be, like you said, you could take a pre-sintered zirconia, like in the white chalky state, and like you said, you could dip in stains that go internal to zirconia. And then I guess the advantage of that from a laboratory standpoint, I'm imagining, is the fact that you could just carry one, fewer number of shades of your pucks and then use these stains to stain your puck accordingly. As far as like material disadvantages of that, I don't know of anything of like the adding those stains necessarily making the zirconia weaker or less tough or anything like that. I'm not aware of. I'm not saying that I know, but I'm just not aware of anything of that being a disadvantage. I mean, and then the alternative to staining would be to like, you know, mill it all out of one solid color and to do external stains. Like I think of like the Mio system or something like that, where you're just painting on external stains. Which I think one of my good buddies does a lot of research in North Carolina, Taser Solomon. Well, he compared zirconia stains versus our lithium disilicate external stains. I have to go back to literature to see which one he said stayed on better. But in our experience, when we've tried to toothbrush off like zirconia stains or put them in lactic acid and just leave them in a bucket for like a week to try to get it off, like we can't even get that stuff off of there. So I think that those external stains can stay on pretty well, but I guess there is always the possibility if your patient maybe is like has a lot of acid and brushes their teeth vigorously that the external stain could come off. And so now you'd have a ugly, white crown underneath the external staining. And then now, so that I guess my thought with the multi-layer as far as color is that, um, I think the disadvantage of any shaded block is that of course your inventory's got to be higher. Um, but the advantage being that you can get internal staining within the block that like isn't reliant on external staining that could potentially get acid eroded off. We did a review article one time. I remember looking through that literature and there wasn't something that stood out that made me think, oh, dip stains are bad. So and the next topic is like the multi-layer blocks where you've got something like different yttria percentages in the different layers. And that's something we have looked into a little bit more because it's like when you evaluate that, is like, how do you evaluate? The way we evaluate the strength of a material
Is it actually an advantage? Like, because it's billed out as being like, well, you have the strength of the high strength at the base layers, but then you have
yeah.
the translucency and the aesthetics on the incisal layers of having the translucent zirconia. So does that really pan out in your research?
So the little bit that we've done with it, we took a look at the like a 4Y, 5Y material, and we milled a crown out of it where the cervical aspect of the crown was in the 4Y, and then the incisal or the occlusal portion was in the 5Y, and then fractured the crown, and we got similar strengths as the 4Y. Because we were like, if we fracture the crowns, is it going to be the same same amount of load it takes to fracture the crown as a 5Y crown or as a 4Y crown? And it actually did fracture close to the strength of the 4Y crown. So, and that way, I do think it like gave some of the strength advantages of the stronger layer. I mean, of course, not every every zirconia puck is not the same. So the way one might be layered might be better than another. I know there's many different brands out now that have layered zirconia pucks. So like how well those different layers are adhered to each other. And it's not just about like um, the way that they fabricate the puck. It's also the fact that like different types of zirconia, 3Y, 4Y, and 5Y have different sintering uh, parameters. So like making sure that when you're sintering them all at the same time, that things are fusing well is like, there's technology that goes into that. So I think that just because it can work well for some materials doesn't mean you could go to like Lab Day in Chicago and find, somebody's multi-layer zirconia they made in their basement and buy it and sinter it and expect that it's going to do well. I think that you have to go with a company that's actually done some research into it. I mean, like if I was going to buy someone's basement zirconia, I'd be more comfortable buying their solid 3Y than buying their 3Y, 4Y, 5Y.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many different manufacturing techniques that go into zirconia and the sources of the powder. Because I mean, there's really only, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, there's only two sources for zirconium powder for which the Toso powder that goes into manufacturing zirconia. And have you seen any what kind of trends do you see from by the different mine sources of the original powder and also the different manufacturers? Like, have you seen some that are better than the others? And some of them have different grain sizes from one to the next. How much of a difference do you think that makes?
when I think about different technological differences in the fabrication of the zirconia puck, I know about it more from the stage of like what you do with the powder. Like I know when they make the disc, there's different ways that you can press it. They can press the powders into that disc. So like, because it's uniaxial only, just pressing from the top or the
Right, versus,
bottom.
like, hydrostatic, which presses
Yeah,
from all directions.
exactly. Yeah, and I think that just gets to consistency with. I'm imagining consistency with like shrinkage when you're trying to center these things and making sure you're having even shrinkage of restoration. So like I mean, and again, I haven't tested this. My assumption would be something is hydrostatically or hydrostatically pressed from all directions. That if you're trying to do like a 6 unit fixed bridge or something like that, that the fit would be better in something that's been hydrostatically pressed because the particles are more evenly, um, kind of evenly condensed into that puck. So when they all get smaller as they center, that it would more likely shrink from all directions better in a hydrostatically pressed puck versus one that's only been isostatically pressed.
Yeah, that has been my experience, especially when you get into larger, more full arch restorations, and especially when you're that or like you're saying, like large span bridges where you don't actually have as much material connecting one unit to the next. Like if you have like 6 or 8 units versus say an all on X, it's all implant supported, but it's one giant chunk of zirconia, which is which is its own challenge. Uh, have you, so, like, for example, with that, have you seen a lot of, discrepancies in, say, fluorescence and opalescence in different manufacturers or different ways of processing, your zirconia? And, one thing that I kind of brings to mind with that as well is, what's your opinion on, like, fast sintering? Because I know some people one of the big disadvantages to zirconia over the years has been, say, a 8 to 10 hour, sintering time in the oven versus now some of these manufacturers are coming out with other materials or ovens or both that supposedly sinter in, say, 2 or 3 hours. What are your thoughts on that? I know I threw a huge question at you, there's a lot
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, no, so the first one, it's funny that you mentioned to me about fluorescence. I mean, my understanding of opalescence is like depending at the angle at which you view something, it can get different colors. And like that's almost like a weird thing. Like sometimes I look at zirconia crowns like this thing looks like a pearl. Like this is like I almost
Yeah, it
don't want it to
does.
be so opalescent. It's almost unnatural.
Especially if you polish it. It doesn't look it looks very it's shiny, but it's not natural looking necessarily.
Yeah, and that's not something we've never tested because I don't know how you measure opalescence in a laboratory. I'm sure there's some kind of way of like reflecting from different angles and measuring the wavelengths of light coming back, but we don't have a machine that does that. And then fluorescence, I guess, first, I guess fluorescence is like when you have UV light that hits a
Mhm.
specimen and how much visible light gets reflected back off of it. I guess, first I thought the relevance of that was only like if the patient's dancing in like a club, like a discotheque, and they're like, smiling and like how one tooth look relative to the other. And I was always like, that's a very specific thing, especially in the US where almost nobody goes clubbing, at least that I know. But like, I guess there's also some aspect of it is like there is some UV light coming from my window of natural light that could possibly reflect something back differently. So we're actually undergoing it. We're doing a study right now. We're sending specimens to the University of Michigan, and we're testing fluorescence of. Actually, we got this research grant from the American Academy of Aesthetic Dentistry to measure the fluorescence of 3D printed zirconia. I have to say, I didn't propose a project; someone else, a different faculty member, proposed it. For me, I was like, "That's a very specific thing to worry about," but we got like a $5,000 grant to measure that. So we sent out the specimens last week, so we'll know more about. And we're comparing 3Y4 and 5Y printed zirconia as far as their fluorescence, and we'll know more about that later. The other question you asked me that was a great question was about the fast entering of zirconia. So we definitely did a project in that one where we got some of Katana had an 18-minute sintering zirconia that we evaluated, and we compared it against um, a katana that was fired for 8 hours, and then we also took some Toso zirconia that wasn't in like a sample that wasn't intended to be fast sintered, and we sintered that for 18 minutes and 8 hours. And we found out that the katana zirconia that was intended to be fired in 18 minutes, we could fire it and we got the same strength and the same optical properties. We looked at it under SEM and there's no porosity in it. We had our sample specimen that we made of the Toso powders, and when we fast fired that, we got full porosities, really opaque, low strength, and then 8 hours it was fine. So I think that there's technology that goes into that to allow them to do that fast sinter. Do I know what the technology is? No, I have no idea. But from as a classical engineer, a lot of times we just study see what happens to things and try to understanding what happens. We're like, oh, the chemists and the physicists, they have to, we're just engineers. We'll give you the strength. So it can work. We can get similar strength and translucency rather, and absence of porosity in an 18-minute sinter with the material that's intended for that function.
I think it's fascinating to see that zirconia is coming up in this new direction of addressing the short turnaround times. One of the big disadvantages, of course, was up against lithium disilicate's e.max options is how rapidly you could process them versus zirconia, and taking just by its nature up until apparently now, like a full day to process,
Right.
and how that compares with the upcoming 3D printed options, both zirconia and some of the nanoceramic hybrids, which I really want to get into with you. But before we do that, I really wanna know more about how you test these things. Like, what kind of processes, machines, what kind of material science goes into testing this both the toughness, the flexural strength, the fractional strength? What goes into that in your lab, and your research? What kind of tools do you use?
This is a like this is like a great line of question. Like sometimes I do like a interview or a podcast and I'm like thinking to myself, like nobody how is anybody getting any relevant information? We're just BSing around about useless stuff. But these are great questions. Like I love these. So when we measure strength in the laboratory, there's different tests we can do, as you mentioned. I mean, there's flexural strength test. Like almost nobody does a tension strength test, meaning they don't just pull a piece of zirconia apart. And nobody does a straight compression test because I mean, I don't if I would break my machine before I could break a piece of zirconia in compression. I would never be able to smash it. So we do flexural strength tests, meaning like we have a bar of something and we support it and then we break it from the middle. And so there's two big kinds of flexural strength tests. So there's 3-point bend flexural strength test, and then there's biaxial flexural strength test. And that sounds like a nerdy thing to differentiate about, but it actually makes a big difference. And there's this, I'll share a story from several years ago where they made a big deal out of this. So the typical has been a 3-point bend flexural strength test where we have a bar, we support it on 2 points, and we break it from a third. That's why it's a 3-point bend flexural strength test. And then we get a value, like a 3Y zirconia is around 1200 megapascals of strength. The 5Y might be something around 500 or 600 megapascals of strength. There's another kind of test you can do, which is a biaxial flexural strength test, which is instead of having a bar, you have a disc and you support it on 3 balls on the bottom, and you have a fourth ball from the center that comes and breaks it. And that one will also give you a value, 1200 megapascals, values like that. The difference being that with a 3-point bend flexural strength, with ceramics, you're always going to get lower values than with a biaxial flexural strength, because with the ceramic, when you make a 3-point bend flexural strength test, you've got, when, you got students or you or somebody, technician or something's making the specimens, they've got to like make that bar that has these sharp corners in it. And the sharp corners, when you put them under stress, when you test it, they can have little flaws in there that can cause fracture. When you have a biaxial flexural strength disc, the highest amount of load is right underneath the indenter, which is in the middle of that circle. So there's no cracks or anything there. So ceramics do much better under a biaxial flexural strength than a 3-point bend flexural strength. Why I said that's relevant is like you might go out, pick up a brochure, and there's like, oh, this got a flexural strength of 1500 megapascals. And look at this junk over here. It's got a flexural strength of 600 megapascals. You got to say, well, are they both biaxial flexural strength? And I remember, and I love Ivoclar, and I actually love e.max as a product. But I remember when they came out with e.max 500, we're like, what is this? Is it new e.max? Like, no, we just started measuring biaxial flexural strength rather than 3-point bend flexural strength. And so now it's 500. It used to be 348 or whatever. So it's like the way you test flexural strength, I mean, the values you get can be highly dependent if it's biaxial or 3-point bend flexural strength testing. And honestly, for ceramics, it's probably more conventional to measure a biaxial, like a disc specimen, and get those higher values. But you just have to make sure that you don't have someone comparing a biaxial value to a 3-point bend value if you want to try to pick which zirconia you're going to buy. And then you mentioned some other tests. Like there's a test that's really important for ceramics called fracture toughness, where you have some type of a bar, you start a crack in it, and you see what load does it take to drive that crack to failure, because ceramics all fail by crack propagation.
Uh-huh.
And honestly, it's funny because I think there's like one guy in the US that does the best job at fracture toughness testing, who's Tom Hill at Ivoclar, and they make the specimens. It's super hard to make we don't even try to make the specimens anymore. It's so hard to make the specimen and get that crack in there and get the crack the right length and measure it, make sure it's right, that we just can't even do it anymore. There's people that do it well in Europe and they report values, but like it's a super hard test to do. It's really easy to make that crack with like 3D printed materials because they're softer and you could like use a little saw blade to make the crack. But like for ceramics, it's really hard to do that. So if somebody reports fracture toughness to you and they're a dependable source, like that value, those data is actually really gold. It's great to get that information. Those are probably two of the, when I think of strength of material, I think of primarily of the, 3-point or biaxial flexural strength, and then also what's its fracture toughness. Those would be numbers that I would be looking out for.
Sounds to me like the biaxial strength test is a lot more applicable to dentistry anyway, considering the kind of environment that a crown is subjected to.
Yeah. Yeah, to an extent. It's like we were just having a class. I have teaching class an hour ago, and we were talking about like where do crowns fail. And I mean, crowns, there's a theory that crowns fail at like at the margin, at the interproximal margin, where you kind of have this moon, like the interproximal margin isn't as flat as like the buccal and lingual margin. You kind of have this kind of curvature to it, and when the patient bites down, it has like kind of this opening force at that interproximal margin, which can cause cracks to grow through the material. And so that's one place where cracks are supposed to originate. And then additionally, if there's any kind of defects on the intaglio surface of the crown, they can originate. So that intaglio kind of fractures, those ones, yeah, definitely would be more applicable to a biaxial flexural strength type setup. And then modeling, I mean, there is a third way, which we do test the crowns, is sometimes we literally just make a crown and then we break it. So when you do that, all you can do is compare different type. You can compare like, one brand to another. Like the value I give you is meaningless. Like if I told you, oh, I fractured a crown at 700 Newtons, well, it makes a difference. Was the crown a millimeter thick? Was it 1.2 millimeters thick?
Right. Yeah.
Was it a molar? Was it a premolar? So the value is useless. All I could say is, well, we made our new Zirconia broke at 700 Newtons and our old one broke at 400 Newtons. And so the new one's better, but you can't really just report that number. So we do a lot of that kind of testing too in the lab, where we will make a prosthesis like an implant supported bridge or a distal cantilevered bridge or a crown or some type of an onlay or something, and then we either fatigue it or we just fracture it and look at the load it takes for it to fail.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, because that's a little bit more applicable to just daily dentistry anyway.
Yeah.
And you mentioned e.max 500 earlier, which I think is an interesting little outlier on its own. So you do hear a lot of words like, 500 MPa, 1,000, 1,500 MPa, megapascal, thrown around as comparative numbers for these materials, but also the nature of zirconia versus lithium disilicate materials like e.max is a little different. I mean, the chemistry is different, so the behavior of the material is different. Do you think that the same number from one to the next is directly comparable? Like, for example, if you had like a 500 MPa zirconia versus a 500 MPa e.max situation,
Yeah.
and one other follow-up to that, just kind of baking that in, no pun intended,
Hmm.
uh, is do you see a difference between, say, pressed e.max versus milled e.max in comparison to, say, zirconia?
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the first, getting to the first question first is like if you had e.max at 500 megapascals and let's say you had a 5-way zirconia at 500 megapascals, are both of those is that the same thing? I mean, there's two ways I could look at it. I mean, first, there's, with e.max, it could also depend, is it bonded to the two structure? Is it conventionally cemented with RMGI? Because if you bond something to the two structure, then that's going to make it stronger. Whereas if you conventionally cement it, it's not going to reinforce the material nearly as much. So there's that kind of differentiation. And then I guess there's something else that I should mention. And it's funny because, again, I was just teaching this in class an hour and a half ago, is that, when we talk about these values like 500 megapascals, that's a static strength value. Because sometimes people say to me, well, if zirconia's got a 1,200 megapascals of strength, and that means in your machine, when you work it all out, that you probably fractured it around like maybe 1,000 newtons of force. You chew a piece of bread with 40 newtons of force. You chew a carrot with 100 newtons of force, and maybe your maximum clench is like 500 newtons, and then the zirconia goes up to 1,000 newtons before it breaks. Why does it even need to be any stronger? Well, the idea is that your teeth aren't meant to chew one piece of food one time. I mean, your teeth are going to be chewing food cyclically for millions of cycles. And so whatever value something fails with in a static load, like a one-time test, it's going to be a much, much lower value that it fails with under fatigue. So that's another kind of test I forgot to mention that we also do is we'll make specimens, disc or broads, disc or bars or crowns. And then we got another machine which just fatigues the hell out of them, just slams them for like a million cycles at a specified load. And then we see, you know, what um what load they can go to at, like, some of these set a runoff is a million cycles. So like just because it has the ultimate strength of being able to go to 1,000 newtons when at one time, maybe it only can go to 250 newtons at a million cycles. And so so that if you have that e.max 500 and the other zirconia at 500, would probably be even more interesting and more relevant is like what load can it go to at a million cycles. And then for the second part of the question about like press versus milled, as far as strength, we've never tested. I've looked in the literature and that, like, if there is a difference, is I would think of it being relatively minuscule as far as strength goes. I mean, there's also this question of like how accurate are the margins of milled versus pressed. And again, I remember writing this review article and looking up the data on it, and the research articles that had been published had shown no difference in the fit and the margins of milled versus pressed. If you talk to most dentists and labs, though, I feel like they would disagree with that statement. I think anecdotally, most people expect that a pressed lithium disilicate crown is going to fit better than milled. I mean, personally, I think our lab is pressing them all for us, so I don't have as much experience with milled lithium disilicate. But yeah, as far as it's interesting. I'm gonna have this. I have this continuing education event I'm going to be doing in a couple of months, and it's going to be myself. It's going to be a practicing dentist, and it's going to be somebody coming from the lab, and we're all going to be talking actually about this similar topic of zirconia and lithium disilicate. And I think there's like so many different perspectives of which you can come at it. And my personal bias is I'm so focused on research that I'm like, well, if the research says this is what I believe. But something to like, well, I've done 10,000 crowns or I have a lab and I make 1,000,000 crowns, and I can tell you, that we get sent back, milled ones and the pressed ones all seem to fit. So there's so many different ways to look at it that from my particular bias as far as studies, like I haven't seen a huge difference in pressed versus milled.
Well, that's what makes this conversation so fascinating, at least to me anyway, is that lining up the anecdotal experiences against actual research numbers. So the anecdotal versus the research is always interesting to put next to each other, especially with having the numbers to line up with that. And speaking of, one thing that I hear a lot of anecdotal information about that I don't really see the research as much following up yet is the advent of the new 3D printed permanent crown options as well as the temporaries, both zirconia and the nanoceramic hybrid options, which there seems to be a varying kind of narrative there, whereas some manufacturers seem to be saying that it's a nanoceramic hybrid based on the material science and this is how it works, versus we're just trying to make sure that it qualifies for the insurance so that it's 51% zirconia, and that way it can be billed as a ceramic restoration as opposed to something else. What are your opinions on that? What's been your experience with that so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you read like the ADA definition of ceramic that I guess the big modification on it was that it's always been something that was predominantly, well, not always, but I think since like the advent of milled composite, they have the definition that if something's predominantly refractory compound, so predominantly ceramic, then it qualifies as defined as a ceramic. And so it's funny I ChatGPT the word predominantly, and ChatGPT predominantly means over 70%, but somebody has reinterpreted it to mean that predominantly means 51% filler, that it can qualify as a ceramic. And the big change that came recently was that they took away the word like pressed, milled, or they left it ambiguous as to the fabrication technology. So that meant if it was printed and it was more than 51%, now we've decided that the ADA could classify this as ceramic, so you could bill it out as a ceramic. At first, I thought that was the motivation to which they were trying to introduce filler particles beyond 50% or beyond 48%, because we did notice initially that when you start looking at strength, like you don't have to get to that 50% mark to start seeing the highest strength. Like we saw some of these like 30 some percent filled materials. We had a publication out that was like I think we were comparing like ceramic crown, like from Sprint Ray to like Onyx. I think it was maybe the original Onyx or something. And the original Onyx had like similar strength as the ceramic crown, even though the Onyx was like less filled. And so it's not like you have to get this certain filler percentage to achieve strength, but there are two other properties that you do need to get to in order to achieve, that you do need to increase filler to achieve. And one of them is modulus. Like, the stiffness of the material is highly correlated with strength. I mean, highly correlated with filler. Like filler and strength are not as correlated, but filler and modulus are pretty well correlated. So like all these composites are like, if you look at like a Filtech Supreme like paste composite, direct composite, modulus around 12, still less than Denton, but around 12. If you look at 3D printed, it's like at 8s, 7s. And then it isn't until you start looking at some of the 3D printed that are in like the 60, 70 percentile where you start seeing this modulus that's even somewhat similar to direct composites. And the other thing is hardness. In order to get something harder, you add more filler particles. And hardness, though, the intent of making something hard, because you don't care how hard something. Nobody like, I need to have hard teeth. You just want wear resistant teeth. And so hardness is kind of an implication of wear resistance. Interestingly enough, I'm like sharing with you so much stuff that I was at some point kind of holding back a little bit because haven't really published any of this yet, but hardness of 3D printed specimens hasn't necessarily correlated with wear. We're still messing around with that in the lab. I mean, our assumption was harder specimens wear less. That hasn't totally held true, but I'm not just not sharing this to hold back. It's just haven't figured that out yet. We haven't
It's
tested that.
ongoing research, but that's interesting that so far it's that the hardness is not necessarily correlated with wear.
Hardness
And
not necessarily correlated. Hardness is very easy to measure. There's not a lot to it. It's a very easy property to measure. Wear is trickier. There's so many variables that go into how you replicate wear in a laboratory that I don't know that our wear methodology is gonna totally represent clinical situations.
right, there's only so much you can test, but I mean, you have to have some kind of numbers to go on. So it's better to test than not to test, right?
Yeah.
With the ceramics coming from, say, resin-based 3D printing versus there is not even on the horizon anymore, there's a few companies that are 3D printing sort of traditional-ish zirconia. Where do you see the future here? Do you really see that 3D printed zirconia will catch up? I mean, I know it's hard to speculate, but if you could sort of dive into your crystal ball, with your experience and your insights, where do you see that catching up? Do you see the future taking off with the resins, or do you think, the other more traditional materials like e.max and traditionally milled zirconia will remain dominant into the future?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I would have thought my assumption would have been that like 3D printed ceramics would be where it would have to go in order to like get properties that are going to match the ceramics we're using. Because I just don't see how we're going to be able to go from a 1200 megapascal strength zirconia that we're used to like using and abusing, making 3D and posterior bridges and short second molar crowns and stuff like that, to all of a sudden go into a material that's got a flexural strength of like 100 megapascals. To use the workhorse material. Like I just don't see it. But like I could see us going to like a 700 or 800 megapascal 3D printed zirconia. So we've just done the very initial work with, I mean, we're just kind of getting into testing of 3D printed zirconia. Like I said, I've seen like Sinto and 3D Ceram and some of these companies. Those are the ones I'm aware of that do 3D printed zirconia. What I've seen with that has been interesting in that it's a very long processing time, apparently, to debind the. I mean, when they print it, obviously they're printing ceramic particles bound in resin, and so they have to get rid of all that resin. And the process of getting rid of all that resin is a technique-sensitive thing. And like we did have this. We have a resident. He's a ceramic engineer, and he's one of our students. And he found a company kind of on the internet that that they were like, oh, we 3D print zirconia, and we just burn the resin out in a furnace, and then you can sinter it. And they sent us a specimen, and the stuff was like so garbage. And we looked at a microscope; it's just full of holes. Like the density of the stuff is like 80 some percent, whereas most of it's like 100% dense, and like has 10 billion problems with it. And it's ugly. We haven't tested strength yet, but I'm sure the strength is gonna be terrible. So like that whole debinding process is like very critical, I think, to get rid of porosity so you have good aesthetic properties. And probably we haven't started testing strength yet, but it's probably also going to affect strength. So I have seen some papers like from very respectable research groups like Bart van Meerbeek and stuff, where they've shown that 3D printed zirconia with similar strength as milled zirconia. But I think the processing right now would be so cumbersome for the labs, like even to get our research specimens. I mean, the price that we're paying for a specimen is like pretty high. So it's like, it's definitely not there yet commercially. I think that they got to figure out how to make, and the ones that we're getting, the definitely the opacity is not good. So yeah, it definitely needs some improvements. I think that if they learn how to, debind and sinter it better to make something that looks nicer and it's also more efficient, that would be great. I don't know if, it'd be awesome if you could have that chair side something that you could chair side 3D print and then debind and sinter, but we're a long way from that as far as I've seen right now. So I think but if I was going to invest money into something like, put your money in now and then you get to go in a time machine and go 4 or 10 years, I'd probably put it in the 3D printed zirconia.
Really? In spite of the fact that I mean, that's interesting because it sounds like, with the debinding process, you're instead of going down in time, like from the 8 to 9 hour sintering with a milled zirconia down to like, well, like you said, with the new Cure stuff, like the 18 minutes, which is very
Yeah.
impressive. You're going kinda backwards, adding in like an additional day's worth of processing. But,
Yeah.
also, I mean, we can just remember where Bruxer and lava crowns came from, where it looked like a, chunk of soap 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and then now these are some of the highest aesthetic restorations we can provide.
Yeah.
So, I
That's what I'm
do hear
saying.
yeah, interesting perspective on that for certain.
Yeah. I would only do that if I got to like put my money down and hop in the time machine, like painfully wait for the technology to progress. I don't think it's gonna happen like tomorrow. I don't know. Maybe AI robots will expedite the process so that we'll see it figured out in 2 years. But
AI material science research.
yeah, ChatGPT. I mean, ChatGPT. How do we make this faster? Oh, that was how.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, let it do a 10,000 simulations for you and then come back with the best guess.
Well,
And, speaking of, so you're saying that you would so for example, if you were looking at maybe investing in either a 3D printer or a milling machine, which do you think you'd put your money into?
well.
I know that they're not one-to-one comparative options there, but
Yeah. Yeah.
especially if you're like a clinic and you're looking at getting one or the other or both, where do you see your investment going?
Yeah. Mm, I guess probably I've got both, and the one I've used more is a 3D printer because I use a lab to make all the rounds. And so I've got a mill that I could be milling all of I do a lot of e.max onlays, and I could be learning how to like design my own e.max onlays and then mill them myself, but I don't. I use the lab to do it, and then the 3D printer, I use that for making splits and splints and models, and I don't use any of them for crowns. So if I only had to get one of them, a 3D printer is like $10,000 can caboodle. Mill is like you got to have design software. Assuming you already have a scanner, you have to get design software, and then you have to get a mill, which is expensive, and then replace the burrs and buy the blocks and everything like that. It's a big investment. So I guess in that way, but my personality, I would get the 3D printer, but I wouldn't personally be using it for crowns though. If I went to practice and they said you can only have one of these two things to make crowns out of, like we can't use a lab, and now we live on the moon, and so there's no labs. You have to you get to take one thing on your spaceship with you. I'd probably take the mill. If they're like you have to do all the dentistry for all your family members, and you're all gonna live on the moon, I would say, okay, I'll take that. I'll take the mill, and I'll mill out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, the 3D printer is a little bit more of a Swiss Army knife when it comes to different dental applications, but as far as making long-term restorations, the mill's probably the answer. Milling e.max for sure is going to be lower cost barrier of entry because I mean with zirconia you also have to have the zirconia sintering furnace, which is its own animal there. So yeah, I can see where they'd come from with that for sure. And man, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your time with all this.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks, man. I remember when people don't know this because they didn't get to see the pre-interview, but I started this interview in a terrible mood because I'm having a terrible clinic day. But you put me in a good mood, so I really enjoyed the conversation. Now I have to go back and deal with my terrible clinical problems. But thank you for letting me like that. It was fun.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for being with us. Where can people find you online if they want to know more about your research or your practice or your work?
Yeah, sure. We have an Instagram account. It's called @dentinal2. My joy in life is going out to different clubs and nerding out about dental materials. We talk about directs and indirects. So all my speaking information is on that website, drnatelawson.com. And yeah, that's where they could go to find me digitally. So yeah, thanks for letting me give a shout out to those. And yeah, thanks again for the
Absolutely.
combo.
Thank you again for being a part of this. We really appreciate you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for watching. This has been the Evolution of Dental podcast. Please look for us on all your major platforms. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this video with your friends, and please never stop evolving.